Uh, can we have the slides or?
What?
Yeah. Okay. So I think we slowly start. Yeah, great. There's your yes, I certainly hope so. Do we have a slide to advance the slides? A pointer? Or you need, or does he need to make? Or does he need to make a sign that you move it? Yeah. Okay, you'll have to make a sign. You'll have to make a sign. Okay. Okay, let's go back to let's go back to yeah, that's right. Let's leave it there. Okay. So I would like to start this this session on the future of the world trading system. So, as we just heard in the previous session, where we were talking about the minister talked about the transformation of Europe from an economic entity to a geopolitical entity. I think that summarizes well what the world is undergoing. We do live in an age where geopolitics increasingly dominates economics in international economic relations. And this certainly poses a problem for the global trading system that at least we economists have viewed as a way to increase, to improve resource allocation and economic growth and welfare. That's the way we were looking at the system for its economic virtue. Now, this new age of geopolitics differs fundamentally from the two previous periods that the world has undergone since World War II. From the late 1940s to the late 1980s, 1989, if you wish, geopolitics was a dominant consideration, but it did not interfere with economics inside the Western dominator sphere that wrote the rules of the GATT and largely abided by these rules. This gave huge opportunities for trade and in general for improving of economic situation among the GATT members, among the Western world and its immediate allies. Geopolitics, i.e. the Cold War, kept the other sphere, the Soviet Union, its Eastern European allies, and China outside the GATT and global trade. So that was the picture up to 1989. What we spoke about globalization then was really globalization among the Western countries and essentially their former colonies, but not the Soviet Union, not its allies, and not China. And with India, somewhere in between, inside the system, but on the margin of the system. After the Cold War, after 1989, the global trading system really became global, with now the creation of the WTO and China joining the WTO, Russia joining the WTO, basically every country in the world becoming a WTO member. So it was really became the World Trade Organization. And we had the period on which you, Arvin, have written a lot, the hyper-globalization. And during that period, really what dominated was economic opportunities. The key word was global value chains. Global value chains. I want to join the global value chains. I want to join the economic and the business opportunities that are there. And it was the end of history. End of history means the end of geopolitics, in a sense. And that period lasted for, a good 20 years, 30 years. And then the Western world and the world in general got into crisis. First, the financial crisis. Can't ignore that, before COVID came the financial crisis, then COVID, and now the war in Ukraine. And then suddenly history that had been over came back with a vengeance. And geopolitics was back. And economics again then started to recede behind geopolitics. And I think that's the question, that now we have a global system. In a sense, we have global integration. We are not in the Cold War, where we had two spheres. No, we have one sphere, one global sphere. Globalization is there, but will globalization last? Or will geopolitics destroy the globalization? I think that's really the topic that we want to discuss. So let me first turn to you, Arvind. You are Indian-born, Indian educated first, then British educated, then you worked at the GATT. That's where we met, I don't know, 30 years ago, I can't remember when it was. And then you moved to Washington, to another global institution, the IMF. Then you were at the Peterson Institute, and then you went back to India as the chief economic advisor to the government of India, and now you're back to the US, again, as an intellectual, as a thinker, an economic thinker. So you are really ideally placed to think of, where is the world going? Because the transformation essentially is also related to the role of the advanced economies, the G7, the emerging countries. There was just the quote from Monet, about also not only Russia and America, but also China and India. So tell us, where do you see the system at this stage, and where are we headed?
First of all, Andre, thanks a lot for having me. Great to be on this fantastic panel, very distinguished panel. I'm honored to be here. So as agreed with Andre, I have a presentation which I'll try and go through. And my brief was to be controversial, so I'm going to be a bit controversial. So can we have the slides, please, if you don't mind? Can I just stand while speaking? Is that okay? So my topic is, globalization in what I'm going to call a post-cooperation world. Next slide, please. So I'm going to make just 2 points. The bad news is that multilateral cooperation across the board, finance, climate change, and trade, are dead. Let me clarify what I mean. Remember, all of us here believe profoundly in the benefits of multilateral cooperation. So that's not an issue. The issue is, whether it's feasible or not, and the prospects, which I think are really, really gloomy. And I want to emphasize the word multilateral. Obviously, within Europe, whose raison d'etre is to try and cooperate all the time, is going to be different. You're going to be maybe patchworks here and there of cooperation. But at the global level, what Andre referred to, the one as a whole, multilateral cooperation is dead. That's the bad news. But the good news is, I'm going to say not good news, but not so bad news, is that it is not all bleak. And there are going to be genuine opportunities for some countries, partly for the system. But I think the real challenge for us intellectuals and policymakers, and this is my punchline, is to not be lazy and lapse back into let's cooperate. I mean, some of us are bound to do that, and I think we must continue, but we really have to re-equip ourselves to think about a post-cooperation world. And that's my kind of punchline. Next slide, please. So, when we talk about trade, a part of my remit was also to set this in the broader context of what's happening. I wrote a recent Financial Times piece where I said, there are 5 big shifts going on in the economy. I'll race through some of them. The first one is easy, we're in a world of high inflation, zero interest rates are gone, interest rates are rising, emerging market crises are going to become more prevalent, and we see that already Sri Lanka, Pakistan, parts of Latin America. Second big shift is what I call the end of hyper-globalization. And can we have the next chart, please? I mean, the next slide, please. This is a chart from a paper that Martin Kessler and I did on trade hyperglobalization. You can see we had the first globalization from 1850 to the World War I. Then we had the famous deglobalization period, which Keynes called, the politics of isolationism and militarism played serpent to this paradise. We had the post-war reglobalization, but confined to the West, as Andre said. And really from the late 80s, early 90s, we had this boom of what I call hyperglobalization. And it's clear after that, whether we're going to deglobalize, tread water, what is clear is that hyperglobalization is over, i.e., the rapid rise that just transformed the world. And I want to emphasize that that period of hyperglobalization was the golden age for developing countries. Next slide, which will to show that. Okay, before I go to that, the new threats, I think Andre spoken about geopolitics. I think the hedging, just in case, not just in time, as someone very well put it. And then the whole self-sufficiency drive, food, fuel, drugs, technologies, resources, even. And then, of course, the new threat, the weaponization of interdependence. Norman Angel, as you know, had this great thing called the Great Illusion, where he said, if you trade goods, you don't trade blows. That was the big kind of thing. But I think with what the West has done, beginning with Iran, Venezuela, and now with Russia, I think all countries, including my own, are going to look to ways of diversifying away from dollar hegemony. And what that means is that if there's currency and finance fragmentation, inevitably trade is going to be affected in some way or the other, because finance and trade cannot be decoupled. And then there's a trust breakdown, which I think will affect trade in services and goods. So this is, I think, the familiar new threats to globalization. Next slide. And of course, the era of developing, it's a paper which I've just written with Justin Sandifer and Dev Patel, the age of hyper convergence. Between late 80s and 2015, I would say, it was a golden era. For the first time in history, developing countries as a whole started converging towards levels in advanced economies. But as you can see towards the end, that's fading. And trade affects growth, but let's not forget that growth affects trade as well, and via various channels. So that's going to be another threat to globalization. Change 4. I think this is something that's not, needs to be fully appreciated. Kindleberger always said that hegemons supply public goods, global public goods. We had the UK doing that pre-1914. We had the US doing it after World War II. And then, of course, we had the whole possibility of a G2, China and the US. But it's really become clear, and I wrote this book called Eclipse, where I said, China would overtake the US. I overrated China, but I also underrated the US, because we've now come to a situation where the US is fundamentally unable to provide leadership, because it's so domestically polarized. It's an unreliable partner. If it cuts a deal, there's no guarantee that the next administration will stick to it. It's an unreliable partner. China, we thought under Deng, towards the end, it would supply global public goods. But the gamble that the West took, China will become open once it's become rich, has been kind of doubly thwarted. Now, after Xi Jinping, it's not going to become open. And in the last 2-3 years, it looks as if it may not even become rich. So forget about China and the US. So structurally, which leads to my theme of cooperation, the hegemons are not able to supply public goods. And I've left out Europe, but, I'm not an expert on Europe, but I still am haunted by the Henry Kissinger question, who do we call? You guys have to sort it out. I think Europe is in flux, but that's not my area of expertise. And the fifth point, therefore, is that, as a result of all these things, we're no longer talking G20, G7, G1, but we're in a G- world where everyone's providing global public bads, not global public goods. You saw the response to COVID. It was shambolic. I mean, you would think that this was where cooperation would be so easy. The sums involved were small. The interdependence was immediate and acute. You know, we said no one is COVID-free until everyone is COVID-free. And, you know, it was, vaccine apartheid ruled the system. Climate change is in trouble. I'm going to leave WTO and trade to Annabelle. But I do want to point out one irony. I just said that the US is completely polarized, but the irony is that it is completely bipartisan support on being anti-trade and anti-China. So this is a case where it's also cooperation is going to be very, very difficult. Next slide, please. But I think that let's look at the opportunities. And I'm going to say that there are actually quite a few opportunities for a number of developing countries. Alan Beatty had a very nice piece in the Financial Times yesterday where he said, guys, let's be honest here, the trade folks, that trade is only marginally driven by trade policy. Trade is driven by all these other factors that we've been talking about, geopolitics, technology, etc. But I think the one big exception to that rule, the last time that trade policy affected trade was China's accession to the WTO. That was really trade policy affecting trade at a global level because China liberalized, it grew, the world grew, world trade grew. But as Andre was saying, there have been 3 globalization shocks. One is what happened after the global financial crisis. It coincided with China's Lewis turning point. So China started becoming less competitive. Then we had the COVID shock. It's deglobalizing in goods, but not necessarily in services that I'm going to show you. And of course, the Russian globalization invasion has it's clear that there's going to be deglobalization between us and them, whoever we are, but it's not obvious what's going to happen within the us and within the them. So this opens up opportunities. One example in a paper that I've done, next slide, please. You know, China, between the peak of the global, just after the global financial crisis and 2019, China vacated space of about $150 billion in that period, peak share of world GDP to today. And in some ways, the Vietnam and Bangladesh miracles are in part, you know, China vacating space and countries moving in. Next slide. I think that, next slide, please. You will see that, you know, the black line is trade in goods, but trade in services, you know, I think it's still showing signs, and therefore exporters like India, which are specializing in services, for them there is an opportunity as well. The third, of course, shift, next slide, please, is, you know, China, capital is fleeing China, and that opens up. So if you think about China, it hits the GFC's global supply chain shock and the Lewis point adversely affects China. COVID hitting manufacturing more than services affects China much more. And the geopolitical shock now, of course, Russia has been the main victim, but it's also spreading to places like China. And capital is fleeing these difficult, what we would call odious regimes. And a great example of the opportunities opened up, next slide, is that Apple is considering India as a, you know, not huge relocation, but it's something that I didn't think would happen given what I think that the underlying investment climate in India is not great. But despite that, Apple has said, we want to consider India as a destination for the iPhone 14. So this is a great example of how opportunities are opening up for other countries. But of course, they'll have to do what they need to do to realize these opportunities. I want to talk finally about climate change and trade, where I really think there's something big going on with implications for the trading system as well. I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer. Jacob, my friend here, will disagree with me, but I really think it's a game changer. From carbon taxes to subsidies and industrial policy, from restricting consumption to boosting production, from degrowth to pro-growth. Having lived in India, and I think this is kind of consistent what I think the Inflation Reduction Act represents, India, most developing countries are not going to achieve climate change goals by taxing carbon and by reducing growth. No country, and I would say it's unconscionable to expect India and countries like that to reduce growth, tax consumption. So it is going to be very much a bring down the price of renewables such that it's actually financially viable to have thing. So that's the way climate change is going to proceed. I think the Inflation Reduction Act in the US embodies that. I think Europe is still stuck in this past consensus of, carbon taxes, et cetera, But I want to draw out one interesting implication for cooperation, is that apart from the fact that, basically now it's going to be technology, not cooperation, that's driving climate change. That's the good news, we've been trying to cooperate on climate change for 25 years, very little effect. All these contentious discussions about 100 billion in financing, is it additional, is it plus, is it minus, what do we put in, what out? But for the trading system point of view, what I'm actually very heartened by is I think all this discussion about the carbon border adjustment mechanism is now out of the window. All of Europe was getting very excited about carbon taxes, carbon clubs, and border tax adjustment. I always thought, and I still do, that it's a form of carbon imperialism because you're forcing these higher things. The burden of this is going to fall on developing countries. Now, no more of these carbon type discussions. It's good news because I think things can proceed forward without. I'm being a little bit cheating here because I do think because of this industrial policy approach to climate change, we're going to get other forms of trade activity like, countries subsidizing and raising taxes, wanting to do industrial policy. India, for example, I think has just raised its taxes on solar panels because India wants to kind of do industrial policy. So we may get those kinds of frictions, but the whole thing about, let's talk about carbon taxes and carbon regimes, all of that is over. So just to end where I began, I think really we're in a very bleak period for cooperation, but there are some opportunities. But I really think the challenge for us and people like us is to think about what happens in a post-cooperation world. That's the world. So I would call this the post-Ukraine, post-invasion of Ukraine world as not just a world of geopolitics, but it's a world where cooperation is dead, dead, dead.
Thanks, Arvind. It's great that you shook some of our foundations. That's always very, very good in a think tank, and we need to debate those ideas. Now, the difficult job, I think, is with Annabelle, but I have no doubt that she will rise to the challenge. She is perfectly equipped as a former trade minister from a country, a former think tanker also from the Peterson Institute, and now since last year as Deputy Director General at the WTO. So, Annabelle, is cooperation dead? Does it mean the WTO is dead? How do you see this?
So, first of all, let me thank you, Andre. It's great to be here with you, with Arvind, with Uri, and Doug. I'm actually quite excited to follow Arvind because I think it'll be a lively discussion. So in answering to Arvind, I want to focus my comments on three remarks, and it will not surprise you that I have to say I certainly do not agree with the idea that trade cooperation is dead. But at the end, I think that we arrived to some conclusions that are similar in terms of areas of focus for cooperation in going forward. So the first point that I want to make is that this increasingly fashionable idea that retreating from global trade is in order, I think is not supported by the evidence, and I'll say a couple of points on that. The second point is that I believe that multilateral trade cooperation is still the world's best bet to safeguard and expand growth and development opportunities, to improve resilience, and to support the transitions, the green transition and the digital transition. And the third point that I want to make is that to advance this agenda, a reshaped WTO is needed. And that reform of the WTO has already started with what I would argue is important success at our latest ministerial conference the 12th Ministerial Conference that was held in June. So on the first point about the evidence on trade decoupling and reshoring, I guess many of you may remember the words of the economist Robert Solow, who said back in the 1980s, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. So I want to say, I think it's fair to say that we can see trade decoupling everywhere, but in the data, so far at least. So preliminary estimations that we have run at the WTO do not show trade between blocs falling compared to trade within blocs. For both the US and the EU, trade with China this year has grown faster than with other regions, and it is at or close to record levels. Instead of global supply chains being scaled back, what we see is production networks adjusting, particularly in Asia, and I think Arvind made this point, to take advantage of wage differentials or because of efforts of firms to diversify locations and suppliers. And countries like Vietnam, like Cambodia, like Laos have been big winners of this. And I also agree that this point that Apple is considering India is quite an impressive example of what's going on in terms of these networks adjusting. Now, other indicators point in the same direction. For example, the consulting company A.T. Kearney's reshoring index for the United States has been negative for 2 years in a row. And a recent survey of 3,000 global companies revealed that most have shunned reshoring and nearshoring, preferring instead to ramp up inventories or to diversify suppliers, or in some cases to work with fewer suppliers irrespective of location. And I think this does not come as a surprise, considering the potential high cost, the steep technological challenges, and the uncertain benefits of reshoring supply chains. So it's clear to me that some reconfiguration of global value chains may be warranted, maybe to have a different balance between efficiency and security, but this would not be costless. That is especially true if the larger trading partners decide to move towards full trade decoupling. WTO economists have run simulations for what would happen if the world economy were to break into two self-contained blocks. They found that the long-run level of real global GDP would fall by 5% due to less specialization and technological spillover. And this is not counting other costs like reduced economies of scale, transition costs, and others. And just to put this into perspective, that's well above the 3.5 hit inflicted by the great financial crisis of 2008 to long-run potential output in OECD countries. So having looked at the cost, what about the other side of the ledger, the purported benefits of decoupling and reshoring? And it is true, of course, that trade makes countries more dependent on far-flung production networks and more exposed to cascading risks and shocks. But on the other hand, global value chain integration also allows economies to diversify suppliers, to pool resources, to share information and expertise, all of which makes them more adaptable, more innovative, and more able to withstand crises when they hit. Now, this paradox was at play with COVID-19. Travel and trade and travel ties allowed COVID to expand very quickly around the world within weeks in early 2020. But soon after the pandemic first struck, and after some disruption, and without being perfect, trade and supply chains became key for producing and accessing critical medical supplies. And this is visible in the data. In 2020, even if as the value of global trade decreased by 7%, the value of trade in medical products increased by 16%. So the key question in my mind is whether the role of trade as transmitter of shocks outweighs its role as shock absorber. And here I think that the evidence from several studies, including WTO last year flagship report, our World Trade Report, suggests that it is the role of trade as a shock absorber that the one that dominates, which means that greater participation in trade and in global supply chains, far from undermining resilience, can be a sensible countrywide strategy to manage risk. Now, let's not forget also that purely domestic supply chains are vulnerable to shocks too. We just saw this with the baby formula in the US, for example. And this, I think, will become increasingly clear as the planet keeps heating up and the frequency and severity of localized shocks like floods, like droughts, and other extreme weather events will increase. So in such a world, countries that are better connected will be able to stand better this shock. So all this to say that the answer to a better balance between supply security and efficiency does not lie in decoupling, in reshoring, in self-sufficiency, but in deeper, more diverse, and less concentrated global markets. Which brings me to the second point that I want to make here, the role of multilateral trade cooperation, and is the WTO really fit to manage globalization with all the challenges that are being presented, which I think are real. So, and the question is, well, in these very difficult times, is the best response again to abandon multilateral trade cooperation in favor of regional, geopolitical, or even power-based schemes. And I think this is a mistake. And I think that multilateral trade cooperation is still the best bet that governments have to achieve a number of objectives. And I would like to focus my remarks here on three areas where I think multilateral trade cooperation is critically important. The first one is in safeguarding and expanding opportunities for growth and development for all. So we know and we've heard that multilateral trade cooperation at the WTO underpinned decades of trade-enabled growth and development that have lifted over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. Though of course the pandemic has reversed some of those gains. And in rising incomes and middle classes in emerging economies have also opened new market opportunities for advanced countries and beyond, and of course has increased trade integration has lowered prices for consumers across the world. Now, it's true that some people have been left behind, which partly explains the disenchantment with globalization, and it is equally true that far too many countries, in particular the least developed countries, have yet to connect and benefit from trade and global value chains. But I would argue that multilateral trade cooperation is uniquely capable of delivering more inclusive trade outcomes and actually help countries tap into the new trade opportunities that result from the way in which we do business is being transformed. And here I want to talk about digital services trade, it goes to the point that some of the aspects that Arvind was mentioning at the end, I'm going to go, I guess, to the same places coming from a different direction. I think that, the data tells a very interesting story as regards digital delivered services. They have more than tripled since 2005, registering an annual average growth rate between 2005 and 2019 of 7.3%. And their growth far outpaced the growth of trade in goods and that of all services exports. And the pandemic, of course, has accelerated the shift online. Digitally delivered services exports grew 14% year on year in 2020 and in 2021. And e-commerce sales soared, with estimates suggesting that B2C online retail grew at least 25% globally in 2020, and then again by roughly around 15% in 2021. Digital platforms are also changing who participates in international trade, bringing in more women-owned businesses and more small and medium-sized enterprises. And all this is despite cost of trade being almost twice as high as cost of trading goods, that legal commitments on services trade are generally weak, and that there are no global rules on digital trade. So I think this is an area where multilateral trade cooperation is uniquely suited to bring about change. And one message that I want to leave with you is that change is already happening. In our last WTO ministerial conference in June, countries agreed to continue to extend a long-lasting ban on customs duties on on cross-border electronic transmissions. And in December last year, they agreed on a deal on services domestic regulation that will cut red tape with an impact of $150 billion annually. So this is one area where trade cooperation is very important. A second area is on leveling the playing field. So Arvind talked a little bit about the industrial policies taking place in a number of countries. Well, this will bring in a lot of friction into the system. This will erode multilateral commitments, and this will undermine trust in the rules-based system. At the same time, the world, there are rules, of course, in the WTO in this area, but the world has changed, and there are this is a very different time in terms of when these rules were negotiated. Global value chains are not what they are today. There were no multinational state-owned enterprises, or not in the same way as we see today. And there was not the imperative of supporting public funds to support the green transition was not as evident there. So I think there's a lot to say on leveling the playing field at the multilateral level. And the third point is on climate change. And I don't have a lot of time left, but I want to say that trade and trade cooperation can be an incredibly powerful tool to accelerate the transition to net zero. Not only, we've seen it in renewables, the price of solar energy has gone down tremendously. Trade has had a lot to do with that, but more can be done. More can be done. We have some estimates in the WTO about the impact of reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers on environmental goods, and the results are quite positive. But it's also the case that the cooperation at the WTO is essential to avoid potential trade frictions resulting from the rapid proliferation of increasingly ambitious climate measures, not least the move by some governments to extend carbon pricing to imports. So it's a big role for the WTO and trade cooperation in this area. Now, my final point, and very quickly, is that to advance this ambitious agenda, a reshaped, revitalized WTO is needed, and that has already started. And there is a very clear mandate for WTO reform in our latest ministerial conference to basically improve the way in which our dispute settlement system works, bring in more flexible mechanisms for negotiating agreements, and improving transparency and monitoring.
Thank you, Annabelle. I hope I want to bring in or two other panelists who are online, but I hope that during the discussion we can prolong what you started at the end. That is what happened in the recent ministerial, and whether what happened in the ministerial is an indication that indeed there is the sufficient or the minimum, I don't know what is the correct word, sufficient or minimum amount of cooperation or willingness of members to engage in cooperation to wrong what Arvind warned us against, and about the dead cooperation. But I hope we can come back, and sorry to ask you to conclude at this stage, but I do want to turn to our two great panelists who are online. So first, who is appearing here on the left on the screen, we have Doug Irwin, a professor, a chaired professor of economics at Dartmouth College, and one of the world's experts on the history of trade policy, and in particular on US trade policy. And, you know, Arvind reminded us of Kindleberger's hegemon's view, which I think was a very, very important point. And it's true that, you know, as long as the US was the hegemon of half of the world that was part of the old GATT, the system was working well. And then little by little, things started to unravel. In a sense, one can wonder, you know, Arvind said that the last big trade policy decision was China's joining the WTO in 2001. Now one can ask oneself, and Doug, I'm asking you, whether, in a sense, the US has second thoughts about the system where once upon a time it was the hegemon, and is the US wondering whether, having admitted China, it has created a monster that is a competing hegemon, and whether it's not better to pull the plug on the WTO before China goes even further. So, you know, what is your view about, you know, looking at the long term? What is your view about where US trade policy is now at this juncture, at this geopolitical juncture, with China, with Russia, with a new divide of the world? Where's the US headed?
First of all, Andre, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's great to be here with the great panel and join the discussion. Like Arvind, I'm also an admirer of Charlie Kindleberger for his great work on international economics and economic history. But in terms of his theory of hegemonic stability, he left out one thing, where he didn't quite focus on one thing, and that's domestic politics. And so my message is that US trade policy is in the doldrums. And of course, the doldrums is this region in the Atlantic Ocean near the equator where the sailing ships would get stuck because there would be no wind, and there's nothing you could do before you had the age of the steamship. US trade policy is in the doldrums. And the evidence for this is that we've gone for 15 years now or so since we've had a pro-trade president. The last truly pro-trade president was President George W. Bush. Since then, we've had President Obama, who in his first term did almost nothing on trade. In the second term, began to turn it around by focusing on the TPP. But remember that it was under President Obama's administration that we also began to encounter problems with the judicial system of the WTO. Then, of course, we had Donald Trump, which everyone remembers. And then we now have Joe Biden, who I think it would be a stretch to characterize him as a pro-trade president. He hasn't undone many of the things that President Trump did on trade. Obviously, much more congenial in terms of foreign relationships and working with others and trying to cooperate, but is very much worried about his domestic agenda, the impact on labor, and is very sort of sensitive on trade issues. So the United States is very important for the world economic system and has had 15 years of a president that really doesn't want to lead on trade in any significant way. And the problem, of course, is that Congress cannot lead. So if it doesn't happen by the president, it's going to be very difficult to pull anything off in terms of US leadership. Let me just say two other subsidiary points on this theme. One, both of which unfortunately are dismaying. One is that both parties, and I think Arvind pointed this out, both political parties are now roughly could characterize as anti-trade. The period you were referring to, Andre, with multilateral cooperation after World War II, that was a period of bipartisan trade consensus in the United States. Both Republicans and Democrats were largely supportive, or if not overtly supportive, tolerated US trade initiatives. Since NAFTA in the early 1990s, we've entered a period of bipartisan conflict or partisan conflict over trade. But that was okay in some sense because there was no rolling back. It would just depend on whether one party had the upper hand or the other. But now we're back to a period of bipartisan consensus. But unfortunately, it's sort of flipped and it's an anti-trade consensus rather than a pro-trade consensus. So I'll come to what it'll take to generate US trade activism again in a moment. But in such a situation, it's very difficult to move out of that quickly. One of the consequences is that the US hasn't been seriously engaged with the WTO for some time. And I think even more worrisome than that is that we aren't really looking for alternatives. The big alternative that was out there was the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course. President Trump pulled us out of that, and President Biden has had very little inclination to move back into it. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I guess the broader thing that's happened in the US that has led to this bipartisan consensus and this doldrums is partly a legacy of the China shock, which is something you alluded to, Andre, in saying that we let China in, which had an enormous impact on trade flows. The China shock is over, of course, and labor market economists in the US have shown that basically it's been 15, almost 20 years since we've had negative consequences for US labor markets from the China shock. In fact, of course, today we have a labor shortage with a very low rate of unemployment, and yet the legacy of China shock is still there in casting a shadow on US trade politics because it's cast sort of a bad term on trade agreements or a bad feeling about them. The one thing that could sort of change the situation is also something you've referred to, Andre, the geopolitics of trade, the rivalry with China. But that has not yet sort of stimulated US trade activism. In other words, domestic politics still seems to trump the geopolitics in terms of the fear of China. In fact, one thing Arvind pointed out is that he and others had projected that China would overtake the US in terms of economic size or on various dimensions. With China slowing, and the aging population that they have and the implosion of their working force, in some sense, we might see a receding of the perceived threat from China. Now, there's obviously a debate among political scientists about whether this makes China more aggressive or more dangerous or less so. But if the economic, quote unquote, threat from China seems to recede, of course, setting Taiwan to one side, that geopolitical pressure to do something to contain China might recede. But drawing on history, what does it take to activate the US to become a leader again on the trade scene? Well, if we look to the past, it's always been something external, a discrimination against the US, a compromising of US commercial interests. So the reason why we had the GATT and the US took a leadership position there is not just the implosion of trade during the Great Depression, which adversely affected farm states and US farm exports, but imperial preferences that were thought to compound the problem. And the US wanted a level playing field, MFN, non-discrimination is sort of the rules of the game. Why did we get the Kennedy round? Well, it was the formation of the European Economic Community, which is, we talked about Fortress Europe in recent decades. This was Fortress Europe going back to the 50s and 60s, and the US was very much concerned about the adverse consequences for US producers. Why did we get the Uruguay round? Well, once again, discrimination against US farmers, the rise of non-tariff barriers, sort of took some time, obviously, but that made the US much more active. So the question is, what do we see on the horizon that is a threat to US commercial interests that could stimulate the US in terms of becoming active once again? The answer may be plurilaterals to sort of complement, if not go around the WTO to the extent that the US views China as a blocker. The TPP is not quite on the agenda yet. The Biden administration has put forward the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is what we call in the United States a big nothing burger. There's no opening of the US market, exchange of market access. It's just trying to get other countries to rise to US standards. So I don't think that's going to go very far. But I guess the bottom line is that I think this is a situation where domestic politics trumps global geopolitics. And so something has to happen on the geopolitical scene to really get the US back on center stage.
Thanks, Doug. That was great. It was great to bring this historical perspective. I think very useful, very complementary to the previous two interventions. So Uri, you are in Washington, but you are a Bruegel Fellow, and you are looking at the EU. You are looking at EU trade policy from a little distance. But with very keen interest. You have lots of experience in the private sector, then worked for many years at the World Bank, and so you bring to the table lots of knowledge, also lots of experience, and as I said, a fresh pair of eyes on EU trade policy. So the question that I want to pose to you is, what is, having heard Arvind, having heard Annabelle, having heard Doug paint different aspects of the different responses to the question that I posed at the beginning, geopolitics, economics, where we are. What do you make of all of this for EU trade policy? What should be the stance of the EU at this stage vis-à-vis the world trading system, with, in part, its trade policy?
Yes, thank you very much, Andre. It's a pleasure to share this platform with my friends Annabelle Gonzalez and Arvind, who I've known for a very long time. And of course with Doug Irwin, whose books I admire and I use in my course at the University of Maryland. By the way, to be characterized as a pair of fresh eyes at my age is an enormous compliment. Thank you. Thank you, Andre. Look, the EU is the world's largest trading bloc by many measures. And although its internal trade is far larger than its external trade, the EU's external trade is about as big as China's and the US. And both giants play a similarly, a role of similar size in the EU's trade. But as you know, China is growing steadily in importance and continues to grow steadily in importance. One of the cautions I want to make is not to extrapolate, the last 6 months or the last year, into long-term world history. I think that's a very, very dangerous tendency. So China is rising, continues to rise. And now the EU is, by its construction, multilateralism, and is a strong supporter of the WTO. It's actually unique in a sense because the United States is sort of really now only pays lip service to the WTO. China is a supporter of the WTO, but it doesn't fit nicely in WTO disciplines. So the EU kind of has an alignment between its structure and its worldview at the moment, which makes it especially important in the WTO. Now, EU members, Germany, France, etc., are sovereign nations which have a common tariff and trade policy. Individually, they're members of the WTO, and both individually and through the EU mission as their representative, they support the WTO. However, what is interesting is that France, Germany, and other EU members are by now uniquely well positioned to deal with the fragmentation of the world trading system that Arvind has talked about in particular. According to calculations in a forthcoming paper that I've done with Enzo Dominguez-Prost, EU members as sovereign nations can count on coverage of their exports by free trade agreements of 81%. And that includes, of course, their participation in the European single market. In comparison, the US has only 44% of its exports covered by free trade agreements, mainly USMCA, and China 39%, and that includes RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Economic Agreement in Asia. Okay, if you look at EU members and how many PTAs they have with other countries, I'm talking about France or Germany, it's about 75. Other countries are part of the PTA network of Germany or France, both inside the EU and outside the EU. The US counts 14 other countries as members of PTAs, that it's part of. And China, I think it's about 35. I'm quoting from memory. Okay, so they actually are pretty well positioned in terms of having an additional layer of security and openness in their trade relations compared to the other two giants. Also significant is that the EU, like China, is part of the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement of the WTO with other countries such as Brazil, Canada, and Mexico. And this can serve as a vehicle for dispute settlement, even as the appellate body remains disabled. Okay, so they have some additional layer of security at the multilateral level, at least with some very important partners. And the EU has very active aid for trade, partnership, and accession programs, which help promote open and predictable trade relations throughout its vicinity. And that includes Western Europe, Africa, and the East and South of Europe. China's version of this is the World Reaching Belt and Road Initiative, which of course has very different characteristics. The US has similar outreach programs to its south in particular, but they're not as extensive or systematic as the EU's. Okay, so one way to interpret what's going on is that the United States maintains its export markets open and predictable, less nowadays by the use of trade agreements and development instruments, but instead it has enormous power due to its financial capacity and military superiority. So that's kind of the big picture. Now, that being said, the EU's trade policy must contend with four big challenges. I'm just pointing to the ones that I see as the most important. The first is the unpredictability of the United States. I'm not going to elaborate on Doug's beautiful exposition of the situation. I just want to say that as far as the EU is concerned, this unpredictability of the United States increases trade policy uncertainty across all of the EU's trade relations, bilateral with the United States, bilateral with China, and of course at the multilateral level.
Uri, sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you to wrap up within about 2 minutes?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, and so that's the first challenge. The second challenge is how do you capture the trade and investment opportunities in China, which is going to be by far the world's largest, by far the EU's largest trading partner over time, while preserving NATO and the US security umbrella. As you know, Andre, it is likely that in a context which is not dominated by geopolitics, China and the EU can reach agreement on a lot of contentious issues, as they did in the comprehensive agreement on investment that you and I wrote about. The third challenge is, and here I strongly agree with Arvind, is how does the EU achieve its climate goals without damaging the trading system? The CBAM, as currently configured, is inconsistent with the Paris Agreement and is bound to be challenged in the WTO. It's just not a good scheme, not a smart scheme. And the fourth challenge that the EU has is a very old one, which is how do you contain the agricultural lobbies? It's ironic that the EU is now the largest exporter of agricultural products by far. It is also a large net exporter of agriculture. And still, we have a EU agriculture which is highly subsidized, heavily protected, and of course, it's a heavily carbon emitting sector. the agricultural lobbies continue to be and complicate the task of striking ambitious trade agreements by the EU at both the bilateral and multilateral level. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Uri. So lots of challenges. I'm going to open the floor for discussion. I will just make one point, and I will not ask the panelists not to say anything about this. I'll just make one. I mean, could make so many remarks. I think there's one issue that has been flagged by almost everybody. I'm not sure that it was certainly flagged very much by Arvin, by Annabelle, certainly, and by Doug, and by Uri. I can't remember whether Doug also did mention it. It's climate. And clearly the issue of trade and of climate in and of itself, and then what implication it has for trade and for the trading system is going to be, is already, but it's becoming, whether or not the EU, we heard that in another session, that the EU is probably going to introduce the CBAM, probably with some delay compared to what had been announced, but that it's most likely to be unrolled, to be rolled out. Sorry. So I think this is something that deserves definitely some discussion. But please hold your fire on this, and let me just turn to the audience and ask them for questions. Yes, Jacob. There. So let's take two questions. One question
Sure.
per speaker.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. Well, I actually want to go where you just left up, Andre, and actually ask about CBAM and also the IRA and climate. Because, I mean, I think, it seems to me that CBAM, as it was proposed, was pre-Ukraine, was predominantly going to affect Russia, Ukraine, and a few other countries. Well, I think it's fair to say that situation has rather dramatically changed now. But then perhaps more importantly, Arvin, you described the IRA as a game changer on almost in pro-trade terms. I guess I would say, isn't the IRA also filled with quite a lot of Buy American provisions? Maybe Doug can answer that, but that's certainly my sense of it. But perhaps more importantly, the IRA bill also gives back the US EPA the opportunity to regulate carbon emissions, which means that the possibility of a regulatory price of carbon in the United States and subsequently a carbon club is probably higher than you think.
Thanks, Jacob. I can't see, there was another question. I suggest we take 4 questions about, and then I go back to the panelists, and you pick each, whatever questions. Please go ahead.
Yes, Jan Litjens, Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. I also wanted to pick up on the climate point and in relation to the current energy crisis. To what degree do you believe that this will lead to significant and structural changes in comparative advantages? And what does that then mean for trade policy, trade openness, and maintaining the public support for it? Because with comparative advantages changing, you have winners and losers. And that's always a tricky thing for trade openness.
Thanks. So the next question is for Mia here in front.
Yeah, thank you. I was also very interested in asking about CBAM, so thank you for expanding on that. And I think it will definitely happen. But I also wanted to ask Arvin to maybe elaborate a little bit more on actually how we should equip ourselves. You talked a lot about the threats and the big shifts and everything horrible, but actually, what is the way forward? If you could talk a bit more about what we should do. Thank you.
And the last question is for George.
Yes, thank you. I would like to comment that when Arvind said that China perhaps never open, I agree with that, never rich. So how do you define rich? On a per capita basis, not. But on a GDP basis, it will soon pass the United States. And that gives power to spend on armament and invest in Africa and all sorts of places in exchange for raw materials, etc., technology, etc. So there might be a shift in globalization, a shift that is maybe around China and the rest of Asia, and maybe a different globalization that's in the Western world. So there might be a fragmented globalization, and I would call that maybe as globalization 2.0.
Very good. So 4 questions, 4 panelists, 9 minutes. That's 2 minutes each, I'm afraid. Arvind, and I will be enforcing the 2 minutes. Arvind, your 2 minutes.
Let me...
Microphone.
I think Jacob's question, I think probably Doug is probably the best person to answer that. Let me just take up the broader question of, I'm being a bit negative. How do we go forward here, right? See, I think on climate change, and it kind of maybe addresses some of these questions, is that I genuinely feel that, either technology saves us or nothing does. Cooperation is not going to save us, because that cooperation is not going to happen. And even if it does happen, it's going to lead to a lot of conflict. That's why, more and more, I think I'm not an expert, but putting all our eggs in this technology basket. And that's why I think Jacob raises a fair point that, while there's going to be no free luncher, because the good news for me is that the more everyone subsidizes technology, and I have no problems with that, the more the public good you're creating. I mean, you're reducing price of renewables globally. And, and let's be fair to China. To some extent, China has done that by, its industrial policy on panels has been a global public good. There's no question about that. So I see more and more, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be friction from that. If India wants to start solar panels, but I think that's a trade-off I'm kind of a little bit hopeful about, because, because having lived in India, having been in policy, I just don't think, carbon taxes and any kind of narrative of degrowth is going to get us there. So it's really a technology game. I'm not saying it'll solve it, but I don't think there's any other game in town.
Annabelle?
So I want to pick from this point to say that technology, I am also a believer in the fact that technology will save us. But technology is actually developed and manufactured in around maybe 10, 12 countries around the world. So how do you get technology to where it is produced to where it is needed? And that can only happen through trade. So to me, this is why trade will continue to have a very, very important role to play in addressing climate change. And cooperation, whether countries want to do it or not, it's inevitable to a certain degree, because you will need to address those frictions that are created exactly by the points that you were mentioning, or that we have been discussing here so far. And then again, that needs to happen somewhere. And this is not an issue that can happen only within a region. Or this is not an issue that can be managed only with power-based relations. No, ultimately, you need to sit down and maybe negotiate an agreement to reduce tariffs and barriers on environmental goods and services, for example. And then have a forum for discussing all these other trade frictions. And then maybe some rules as it relates to subsidies, either to allow for those subsidies when they're needed, but also to put, again, some guardrails on the spillover effects of some of the subsidies. So whether, countries want it or not, my sense is the cooperation will need to happen. Maybe not very happily, but will need to happen in any case.
Great. Doug, how do you see things from a US perspective?
I think
Yeah, on the
everyone's
climate
right.
change.
everyone's right, and I'll just pick and choose from the various comments. Jacob's right that there's a lot of Buy America provisions in the IRA. It is sort of protectionist, certainly tilted towards domestic producers. But as Arvind points out, there's a lot of subsidies for research. And I agree with him that technology is sort of a way out of this. And to the extent that we are subsidizing and pushing at the federal level more research and development, that's a good thing. And I also agree with Annabelle that once the technology is there, it has to be diffused. And the way it gets diffused is by keeping markets open, by cooperating to the extent possible, certainly by international trade. And so hopefully, as this warm summer reminds us, this is an urgent problem and we need to move forward quickly on it.
Uri, the last words are yours.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, look, I just add to what has been said. Climate, I guess I have a lot of experience in dealing with real world problems. Big real world problems don't have a magic bullet in my experience. And certainly that's not the case in climate. And the idea, and again, I agree with Arvind, the idea that, you have a carbon tax and then, all the marginal products and marginal utilities are equated, et cetera, et cetera. This is great economic theory, but it clashes with the political reality that when you try to put a price on something as fundamental as carbon, you have gigantic distributional implications and disruption implications. And of course, that's particularly true between rich and poor countries. So we need a much more sophisticated and diverse approach to the problem. And in my view, the Paris Agreement came closest to this. So I would point to technology, number one. As part of, there's no magic bullet. Technology is one. Adaptation, of course, is very, very important. And as far as technology is concerned, a beautiful book by Bill Gates and others actually who have looked at this and point to the importance of identifying what the green premium is in every circumstance. And how do you get the green premium down? If you can get the green premium down through technology, and once the green premium is reasonable, then you can operate with regulatory solutions. And so, to me, for example, a natural way to develop is like saying, we are not going to have combustion engine cars beyond a certain point, because we know we have pretty good alternative technologies. The move towards nuclear is another possibility, et cetera, in a very, very specific way. And of course, there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation as you approach the problem that way, as a minimum, in consultation and moving together. But the idea of kind of placing a carbon tax on imports is just very divisive, wrong, and it's going to create a lot of problems we don't need.
Thanks, Uri. I'm giving you the 1 minute that Arvind is asking me. Go ahead, Arvind.
This is both a question and an observation as well. I think big things happen in the world when there are major crises and catastrophes. I mean, it's a great, is it a Schumann or a Monet line that, Europe is the sum of its responses to crises, right? It's a great line. And frankly, on climate change, I feel that this whole Russian invasion thing, I think should fundamentally make Europe rethink, the whole, how do you achieve renewables? How do you get to accelerate the net zero, whatever? And I'm hoping that, and it's a question as well. We're looking at the winter and all of that, current gas prices, but beyond, it has to be a major rethink of how Europe thinks about energy. And I think there, all this carbon tax and CBAM are going to be second order compared to the big decisions. See, the US has made its big choice. Now the turn is Europe's, especially in the aftermath of what is this catastrophic shock from Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, we are not going to start a discussion on climate. I mean, I was happy to have a discussion on climate and trade, because I do think it's a very important problem. I just make one point. So I think the situation in Europe is that we have an internal carbon pricing internally. So CBAM, you have to see CBAM as the complementary, the external, not complement. It's not just the version; it's the complement of the internal pricing. Okay, so in a sense, not to have a CBAM now, let's say, to change course on what is, Mia saying, CBAM is coming for sure. Okay. No, the only way, I'm just doing intellectually, I'm not saying that this will happen or not. I'm not talking of politics. I'm just talking of logics. The only way that CBAM would not occur, obviously, there's the element of, what other countries are going to do. It would require from the EU to dismantle its ETS system, its internal pricing model. Because now, with carbon pricing becoming quite high, the issue, the pressure is there on the part of the industry also, that one needs this complementary. Okay, this issue of carbon leakage that, at some stage was irrelevant, and people were writing, there's no carbon leakage, and what is your problem? It's getting there, right? Because the price of carbon is become so much higher. So in order not to have the CBAM, we would have to sort of roll back the ETS system or domestic pricing system. So that would, in a sense, question the entire approach of the EU. I'm not talking externally, internally, towards carbon. I'm not saying that it may not happen, but it would be a revolution. It would be nothing less than a revolution. So, and that's why, since one doesn't normally think that a revolution happens so easily, the message is, okay, CBAM is going to, let's stop here, because we are already far too late, and there's another session. So it was a great session. I'm really grateful to all four of you, and to be continued. Thanks.